Hello, everyone, and welcome to this pre-conference session of AAC in the Cloud. We're glad to have you here today. This session is being recorded with Donnie Denome, and we're excited to have him. The topic we'll be exploring today is plain language for AAC, what it is and why it matters, and we'll turn things over to Donnie.
Hello and welcome to my presentation, Writing in Plain Language. My name is Donnie T.C. Denome, and I represent the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, or ASAN. I am so excited to be sharing this information with you. As I said, my name is Donnie T.C. Denome. I am an autistic, multiply disabled AAC user. I hold a master's in public health degree with a focus in health education for people with disabilities. I am the Inclusive Publications and Research Coordinator at ASAN, WHEREIRE. Where I research, write, and design many of ASAN's plain language publications. A little bit more about the organization I work for. ASAN is a nonprofit organization that seeks to promote and advance the rights of autistic people and other people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. We are an organization by and for autistic people, and we work for all autistic people, no matter their background or needs. We have goals of making society more inclusive of autistic people and other people with disabilities, advocating for better services for people with disabilities, and changing the conversation about autism to center autistic voices. Nothing about us without us. So, what is plain language? Why is plain language important? Plain language is a style of writing that uses cognitively accessible language. Cognitive accessibility means that your writing is easily understandable by anybody, including people with different intellectual and developmental disabilities. We'll talk about the specific features of plain language writing in a little bit. Plain language is important because people with disabilities should have equal access to information. You can write about any topic in plain language, even topics that are very technical or complex. Ideally, all writing would be cognitively accessible or have a cognitively accessible version available, but this is especially critical when writing on topics that directly involve or impact disabled people. Remember, nothing about us without us. Plain language is important because it helps you be more inclusive. A big barrier to access for a lot of AAC users, particularly AAC users with intellectual disability, is that most people don't use plain language. It's hard to be part of a community that only uses language that you have a lot of trouble understanding. Even if you, as an AAC user, don't personally need plain language, I promise you that a lot of AAC users do. Using plain language makes it easier for everyone to understand and is a good way to be more inclusive of all AAC users. Why is plain language important for AAC? Many AAC users are people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. Many of us need plain language. We have the right to access information, too. Many AAC users are also children and young people who, even if they read at grade level, can't understand complex or academic language. Plain language is more accessible to children and young people, too. Many parents, family members, and supporters of AAC users have no background in AAC. Clear, simple language can help these groups learn more effectively about AAC, especially if they don't have support from an AAC expert or professional. Also, some AAC supporters do not speak or read English, or whatever the language you're writing in is, well. Writing in plain language makes it more likely they will be able to understand at least some of what you're saying, and makes it easier for someone else to translate your materials into other languages. And finally, we want more people to learn about AAC. The more people who learn about AAC, the more normalized AAC becomes. Using plain language can help us achieve that goal. Plain language writing is a skill you can learn, but it's often a skill of unlearning. A lot of us have learned to write in ways that are not cognitively accessible. For example, writing for school, where we learn to be more wordy in order to hit word counts. Academia, where a certain level of inaccessibility is equated with credibility. And professional settings, where euphemisms and roundabout ways of writing can be seen as more professional. But like all skills, writing in plain language is something you can work on and improve at. So, what can you write in plain language? Anything. You can apply principles of plain language, which we are about to go over, to any text or idea. Some examples of topics that ASAN has created: plain language resources on Medicaid funding, the HCBS settings rule, police violence and anti-Black racism, racism in community living services, voting rights, the Americans with Disabilities Act, and LGBTQ+ rights. Our focus is mainly on disability topics and topics that affect people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but you can write about any topic in plain language. Okay, let's get down to business. What are the different parts of plain language? There are 8 main features of plain language writing. Plain language uses shorter sentences and paragraphs. Plain language uses more common words. Plain language gives definitions for important, more complex terms and jargon. Plain language uses examples to help readers understand ideas in a more concrete way. Plain language avoids unnecessary information. Plain language uses clear language, and plain language uses straightforward language. Finally, plain language uses active voice instead of passive voice. Let's go over how most of the rest of this presentation will be structured. For each feature of plain language, I will talk about 5 different things. I will talk about what the guideline, or rule, for each feature is. Then I will talk about the reasoning behind the guideline, or why the rule is what it is. Next, I will talk about tips, or how people can follow the rule. I will give an example of what the rule looks like in practice. And then I will give an activity where you can try applying the rule yourself. The first feature of plain language is shorter sentences and paragraphs. The guideline is that sentences should be 10-15 words long. Paragraphs should be 5-7 sentences or less. For reference, 10-15 words is about the length of one line of text in standard 12-point font on a page with 1-inch margins. The reason is that long sentences and paragraphs can be inaccessible to some readers. Readers might lose track of the point of the sentence or paragraph by the time they get to the end. Here are some tips for writing in shorter sentences and paragraphs. Look for parts of the sentence that are set off by commas, parentheses, or dashes. These can often be turned into their own sentences. You can also look for joining words like and. Can the part after the end be its own sentence? Look for phrases that can be shortened. For example, in order to can just be to, and due to the fact that can just be because. Here's an example of writing shorter sentences. The original sentence is Bob usually ate breakfast. That morning, he chose to skip breakfast because he knew he'd end up being late for his doctor's appointment if he took too long, which is 28 words long. We can break that up into the sentences Bob usually eats breakfast in the morning. That morning, Bob chose not to have breakfast. Bob skipped breakfast so he could make it to his doctor's appointment on time. Those sentences are much shorter and easier to comprehend than our original sentence. Okay, so here's our first activity. I'm going to read this sentence out loud. Feel free to pause on this screen so you can copy the sentence down and translate it into plain language. The sentence will also be available on the slides that go along with this presentation. The sentence is, AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication, or ways of communicating when oral speech is not an option, which can include high-tech speech-generating devices or computer and tablet apps, mid-tech options like fixed display devices, and light-tech letter or picture books or boards. 42 words. This sentence is 42 words long. How can we turn it into shorter sentences? Here's one way to break up that mega sentence into a paragraph of shorter sentences. This is not the only way. Your translation may vary. Here's our new paragraph. AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. AAC is ways of communicating when oral speech is not an option. AAC can include high-tech options. Some examples of high-tech AAC are speech-generating devices or computer and tablet apps. AAC can include mid-tech options. An example of a mid-tech option is a fixed display device. AAC can include light-tech options. Some examples of light-tech options include a book of picture cards or a letterboard. You can see and hear that these sentences are much shorter. The second feature of plain language is that it uses more common words. The rule here is quite simple. Use more common words to explain ideas instead of more unusual words. The reasoning is that using common words makes it more likely that your reader will understand what you're saying without needing a dictionary. If your reader has to look up words in a dictionary in the middle of a sentence, their focus is interrupted. This makes reading comprehension more difficult. Here are some tips for using more common words. You can use an online thesaurus, like thesaurus.com, to find different words that mean the same thing. You can also use wordify.com. That's a website that will take your text, find hard or unusual words, and tell you what kinds of easier words you could use instead. Also, look for simple ideas explained in a complicated way. For example, the outside top part of a house technically doesn't use any hard words, but it's a much more complicated way of saying roof. Here are some examples of swapping out unusual or hard words for more common ones. In the sentence, the task is laborious, we can change laborious to difficult and say the task is difficult. In the sentence, his glasses have convex lenses, we can define what convex means by saying his glasses have lenses that curve outwards. Notice that using more common words may mean rearranging the word's order. Finally, in the example I'll attempt to assist her, we can swap out attempt and assist for try and help to create the sentence I'll try to help her. Okay, so here's our second activity. I'm going to read these sentences out loud. Feel free to pause on this screen so you can copy the sentences down and translate them into plain language. The sentences will also be available on the slides that go along with this presentation. The sentences are, Leo is cognizant of how to operate his AAC device. First, he places the device in the on mode. Second, he navigates through the assorted menus and selects his speech-generating app. Finally, he depresses the symbolic pictograms to form an outburst. Here's one way to simplify the word choice in these sentences. Remember, it's okay if your translation looks a little different. The translation we went with is Leo knows how to use his AAC device. First, he turns the device on. Then, he goes through the menu and chooses his AAC app. Last, he presses the picture buttons to make a sentence. You can see and hear that the word choice in these sentences is much simpler and more common. Feature 3 of plain language is that plain language gives definitions for important, more complex terms and jargon. We already talked about how in many cases, you can swap more complex words out for simpler ones. But what if a complex word is really important for your readers to know? For example, if you're writing about core word boards, you need to keep the phrase core words. In these cases, you will need to define the term for the reader. If necessary, you will also need to give an example. We will talk more about examples in the next section. The reasoning behind this is that giving the definition of a complex term the first time you use it helps the reader understand the term without needing a dictionary. It lets the reader get familiar with the term they might see in other contexts. Here are some tips for defining important, complex terms and jargon. First, your definition should come right after the first time you use a complex term. You don't have to repeat the definition every time you use a term after that. However, if your document is very long, it may help to remind your readers of the definition a couple of times in the document. Your definition can be multiple sentences. Remember to use short sentences and break up sentences when necessary. And if a term has multiple meanings, you don't have to define all the ways it can be used. You just need to define the way you're using it. For example, say you're trying to define the word pen. You're using it in the sense of the writing utensil, not the place where you keep animals on a farm. So you can define pen as a tool you use to write that usually uses ink. You don't have to include the definition about where you keep animals on a farm. One other thing I want to mention here is acronyms and whether you need to spell them out. You should generally spell out and define acronyms and initialisms the first time you use them. So, if you were writing about AAC, you would want to spell out augmentative and alternative communication the first time, then put AAC in parentheses next to that. The exception is when the acronym is a really common word, where spelling out the full phrase would confuse readers more. For example, when Asen writes about COVID-19, we don't say it stands for Coronavirus Disease 2019, because then we would have to explain what a coronavirus is and why the year 2019 is in the name. Here is an example of defining complex words and jargon that actually defines the term jargon itself. The example is you should avoid using jargon unless it's an important specific word or phrase that the reader needs to understand. Jargon means complex, technical wording that only certain groups would automatically understand. An example of jargon would be lawyers using terms like res judicata or a priori. From this example, we learn what the word jargon means. We also learn some examples of what jargon is. Okay, so here's our third activity. I'm going to read this sentence out loud. Feel free to pause on this screen so you can copy the sentence down and translate it into plain language. The sentence will also be available on the slides that go along with this presentation. The sentence is, AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. The words we are defining in this sentence are augmentative and alternative communication. Now let's look at how we'd add a definition of augmentative and alternative communication to the sentence. Remember, this is just one way to define AAC. It's okay if your definition differs a little. Our paragraph now reads, AAC stands for Augmentative and Alternative Communication. Communication is all the different ways people tell or give each other information. Augmentative means helping someone who can speak with their mouth sometimes. Alternative means helping someone who can't speak with their mouth at all. So, AAC is ways people who can't speak all the time or can't speak at all can communicate. That's a long definition, but it gets the point across in simple language. Feature 4 of plain language is that plain language uses examples. The guideline for this feature is that, when explaining an idea that readers might not have experience with, you can write an example about a fictional person to help illustrate the idea. Your example should be in the third-person point of view, rather than second person. Third person is where the subject of the sentence is a named person. So for example, Harry went to the park. Second person is where the subject of the sentence is you, as in you went to the park. The reason behind giving examples is that examples help readers to better understand the content by walking in someone else's shoes. It makes ideas more concrete instead of abstract. Here are some tips for using examples in your plain language writing. First, make sure your examples clearly illustrate the situation you're describing. For example, instead of saying you could order food for delivery, you could say Janet calls a local restaurant. She orders a pizza for delivery. The restaurant will bring the pizza to Janet's house. This clearly illustrates the general steps of ordering food for delivery. Second, don't let your examples get too long. You can break your examples up into smaller examples. For example, say you're writing about IGAs as an alternative access method for AAC. You'd need an example of what access methods are first, then explain what IGAs is, then give an example of someone using IGAs. Here is an example of using examples. The topic is homelessness. If you were writing in the second person, you could say, if you were homeless, you might try and call the local shelter, but they might not have a bed for you. But remember, plain language writing uses third person for examples, not second person. This is because readers may be confused by second person examples. Readers may not have had the experiences you talk about in your examples, so it's best to use third person. In third person, this example looks like Jim is homeless. He does not know where he can sleep tonight. He tried calling the local shelter. Jim asked the shelter if they had a bed he could sleep in, but the shelter did not have a bed for him. One thing I want to note about examples is that your examples should reflect the diversity of your readership. Your examples people should not all be men with American English names. Make up example characters from all different backgrounds and cultures, too. Okay, so here's our fourth activity. I'm going to read these sentences out loud. Feel free to pause on this screen so you can copy the sentences down and translate them into plain language. The sentences will also be available on the slides that go along with this presentation. The sentences are, if you want to get an AAC device covered by your insurance, you will need to work with a speech therapist. A speech therapist can help you with the process of getting an AAC device. How could we rewrite this example to use the third person point of view? Now let's look about one possible way we could rewrite this example to be in the third person. This is one example scenario. For this activity, I'm betting your example looked a lot different. The example scenario on the screen is this. Fatima wants to get an AAC device. The AAC device Fatima needs is very expensive, so she wants to go through her insurance. Fatima needs to work with a speech therapist. She gets the names of a few different speech therapists from her doctor. Then, she sends emails to each of the speech therapists. Fatima finds a speech therapist who can help her get an AAC device. You can see how this offers a concrete example of someone finding a speech therapist who can help them get a device. The fifth feature of plain language is that plain language avoids unnecessary information. The guideline here is to leave out any information that isn't needed to explain your main points. This applies to both sentences and paragraphs. The reason is that unnecessary information distracts the reader from the main points of your writing. Including unnecessary information can be confusing and make it hard for the reader to keep track of what they're reading. This can also make it unclear about what the main point of your writing actually is. Here are some tips for avoiding unnecessary information. First, figure out what the main point of the sentence or paragraph is. Then, make a list of all the different pieces of information in the sentence or paragraph. For each one, ask yourself, so what? Does this piece of information make the main point clearer? What is this piece of information adding to the sentence or paragraph? Here is an example of deleting unnecessary information. The original sentence reads, "The people of Chicago are used to wearing many layers because temperatures during the winter months can drop extremely low." But what's the main point? The main point is that it gets very cold in Chicago during the winter. So we can just say that as our new sentence. It gets very cold in Chicago during the winter. This is clearer, more to the point, and doesn't distract the reader. Okay, so here's our fifth activity. I'm going to read these sentences out loud. Feel free to pause on this screen so you can copy the sentences down and translate them into plain language. The sentences will also be available on the slides that go along with this presentation. The sentences are, AAC devices can help people with speech disabilities communicate. AAC devices mean people with speech disabilities can be more independent in their communication. AAC devices mean people with speech disabilities can be part of more conversations. AAC devices can help people with speech disabilities during phone calls. TTYs can also help people with speech disabilities during phone calls. TTYs are another kind of assistive technology. Which sentences here are off topic? Which can we delete? So here is what we decided to cut from these sentences. On the slide, you can see that the last two sentences, the ones about TTYs, are crossed out. We're getting rid of these sentences because the paragraph is about AAC devices, not TTYs. Including information about TTYs will just confuse and distract the reader from the main information. Feature 6 of plain language is that plain language uses clear language. The guideline is to watch out for words like this, they, or it. Readers might not be clear on what these words refer to in your writing. In these cases, it is better to say the subject again, or divide the sentence into two sentences. Another way to think about this rule is that you don't want to use pronouns unless the noun the pronoun is referring to is clear. So, avoid saying something like Abdul went to the movies with Jacob. He really liked the movie. In the second sentence, he could presumably refer to Abdul or Jacob. You could clarify by saying Abdul went to the movies with Jacob. Abdul really liked the movie. The reason behind this is that if the reader isn't sure what pronouns like he, she, this, they, or it are referring to, it can be difficult to keep track of what's going on in the text. Here are some tips for using clear language. For every pronoun, check how many subjects the pronoun could refer to. If it's more than one, you need to specify who the pronoun refers to. Make sure you always clearly mention the subject before using a pronoun to refer to it later. For example, you could rephrase the sentence, "It can be hard to get insurance to pay for an AAC device," to be "Many people find getting their insurance to pay for an AAC device hard." That removes an ambiguous pronoun, it, from your sentence. Here's an example of using clear language. The original sentence is, "Sarah works at a grocery store, and this is how she makes money." That sentence isn't particularly clear about what this refers to, especially if it's in a paragraph that mentions Sarah doing other things. We can rewrite the sentence as two sentences that both state the subject. Sarah works at a grocery store. Sarah makes money by working at the grocery store. Now on to our sixth activity. I'm going to read these sentences out loud. Feel free to pause on this screen so you can copy the sentences down and translate them into plain language. The sentences will also be available on the slides that go along with this presentation. The sentences are, Charlie works at a center that helps people with disabilities, along with his coworker, Bob. He has trouble speaking, so his coworker helps him by answering phone calls. His coworker suggests he try an AAC device. Which of these sentences is unclear? How could you clarify who the pronouns refer to? So you can see here how we decided to rewrite these sentences. The new sentences are, Charlie works at a center that helps people with disabilities. Charlie works with a coworker, Bob. Charlie has trouble speaking, so Bob helps Charlie by answering phone calls. Bob suggests that Charlie try an AAC device. We've removed some of the pronouns and replaced them with the subjects of the sentence, which are Bob and Charlie. The seventh feature of plain language is that you want to use straightforward language, or language that says what it means. The guideline here is to avoid using metaphors and similes, sarcasm, and figures of speech like idioms. The reason is that people with intellectual and developmental disabilities may not always understand metaphor, sarcasm, or other figures of speech. Avoiding these ways of writing can make any document more accessible. The big tip here is to read each sentence literally. Figure out if there are ways your language could be misunderstood if someone took the words at face value. For example, take the sentence, "The building was like a mountain towering over the city." Does this mean the building was snowy? Shaped like a mountain? Prone to avalanches? Made of rocks? What the sentence probably meant was the building was extremely tall, so just say that. Here are two examples of using straightforward language. The first is, going swimming was the last thing he wanted. Someone could take this literally to mean he had a list of things to do and going swimming was last on the list. But that's not what we mean by it. We mean, he really didn't want to go swimming. So we can just say that. Another example would be the sentence, "Some people with ADHD say their brains are like wild horses." But what does that mean? That their brains are big? That they're beautiful creatures? We can be more straightforward and just say some people with ADHD say their brains are tough to control. Now on to our 7th activity. I'm going to read these sentences out loud. Feel free to pause on this screen so you can copy the sentences down and translate them into plain language. The sentences will also be available on the slides that go along with this presentation. The sentences are, Marius was as stressed as a snowman in the desert. It was his first time presenting in class with his AAC device, and suddenly his device had given up the ghost. All eyes and ears were suddenly upon him, and now he had a problem beyond his pay grade. This device had cost an arm and a leg, and now it seemed to have kicked the bucket. That's a lot of figures of speech. How can we rewrite these sentences to be more straightforward? Here's one way to rewrite these sentences to be more straightforward. As always, your rewrite may be different than this. We can rewrite these sentences as, Marius was very stressed. It was his first time presenting in class with his AAC device, and suddenly his device had stopped working. Everyone was looking at and listening to him, and now he had a problem he couldn't solve. This device had been very expensive, and now it seemed to have died. Now, these sentences are a lot more straightforward. They say what they mean clearly, and readers don't have to go searching for their meanings. The final feature of plain language is that plain language uses active voice instead of passive voice. Active voice is where the subject does the action of the sentence. For example, in the sentence I kicked the ball, I am the subject of the sentence, and I am doing the action, which is kicking the ball. But if I said the ball was kicked, it's not clear who is kicking the ball. All we know is that someone kicked the ball. The ball is just receiving the action of the sentence. That's passive voice. The guideline here is to use active voice instead of passive voice whenever possible. This is because sentences written in the passive voice are longer and have more complex structure. Sentences written in the active voice are more direct and easier to understand. Here are some tips for using active voice instead of passive voice. First, check if your sentence has a subject doing the action, or if the action is just happening. If the subject is doing the action, it's most likely active voice. If the action is just happening, it's most likely passive voice. If the action is just happening, ask yourself, who or what is actually doing the action? That will help you rewrite the sentence in active voice. For example, the sentence "the bill would be read" is passive voice. We don't know from the sentence who or what will read the bill, who or what is doing the action. But active voice would be Congress will read the bill. In this sentence, Congress is the subject of the sentence and they are doing the action. Here's a fun test to figure out if your sentence is active or passive voice. It's called the by zombies test. To use the by zombies test, cut off the sentence after the verb or action word. Then attach by zombies. If the sentence still makes sense, it's a passive sentence. For example, let's take the sentence "the bill would be read next week." We cut the sentence off after read, which is the action word, so the sentence becomes "the bill would be read." Then we attach by zombies. The sentence becomes the bill would be read by zombies. That still makes sense, so it's a passive sentence. But now let's take the sentence Congress will read the bill next week. We cut the sentence off after read, which is the action word, so the sentence becomes the bill would be read. Now we attach by zombies. The sentence is now Congress will read by zombies, which doesn't make sense, so it's an active sentence. Now on to our 8th activity. I'm going to read these sentences out loud. Feel free to pause on this screen so you can copy the sentences down and translate them into plain language. The sentences will also be available on the slides that go along with this presentation. The sentences are, my AAC device will be paid for by my insurance. It will be made by an AAC company called AAC Plus. It will be put together in Pennsylvania. Then it will be shipped to me in the mail. Every sentence here is passive. How can you rewrite them to be active? Let's look at one way to rewrite these sentences. As always, your rewrite may be a little different from mine. One way to rewrite these sentences is, my insurance will pay for my AAC device. A company called AAC Plus will make my device. The company will put it together in Pennsylvania. Then the company will ship the device to me in the mail. These sentences are all active. So, how do you translate into plain language? This section is going to assume that you already have a document that you want to translate into plain language. Let's go over what we will cover in this section. First, we will talk about how plain language must have the same information as the original source. Then, we will talk about making a new outline. Next, we will talk about defining versus replacing terms. Finally, we will talk about checking the reading level of your new plain language text. Your plain language version must have all the same information as the original source. If you are working from an already published document, you cannot leave anything out. Plain language is not a summary. It is not an overview. It is a direct, one-to-one translation of the original document. You can decide to put more background information into the plain language document. You can choose to reorder sections if it makes more sense that way. You can define difficult words and jargon, but you cannot cut any information. Your plain language version will likely have additional sentences that further explain and clarify the information from the original source. The point of translating into plain language is to widen the audience that has access to the original information. Because of that, you cannot leave out any information. If you leave out some parts, you're not giving your new audience equal access to all the information. I want to talk about this in the context of writing in plain language for adults with disabilities, particularly adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities. A lot of time, when writing in plain language, people feel like they have to censor or cut out harder quote-unquote adult topics. This can include things like discrimination, violence, sex and sexuality, and anything else people feel people with disabilities don't really need to know. But the whole point of plain language is to make sure more people can know about and understand the original text. If you censor your plain language translation, it tells your audience that you think they're not ready to read about those topics. That's really patronizing and infantilizing, and, in the context of disability, ableist. Writing for adults with disabilities and adults with low reading levels is not the same as writing for children. Trust that your audience is ready to read about hard topics. Okay, so now that you know not to cut anything from the plain language translation, how do you start translating? You make a new outline that breaks your complex document into smaller parts. To do this, you'll need to identify the main concepts in your document. For example, if you're writing about how to apply for an AAC device through insurance, your main ideas might be: what is an AAC device? What is insurance? Who can get an AAC device? What do people need to apply for an AAC device through their insurance? How can people find the forms to apply for an AAC device through their insurance? How do people fill out the form to apply for an AAC device through their insurance? And where can people go to get help for applying for an AAC device through their insurance? Creating an outline can also help you fill in information gaps that you may have had in your original document. For example, if your original document says Medicaid in most states will pay for an AAC device, but it depends on your specific policy, you should explain what Medicaid is. You should explain what an insurance policy is. This helps flesh out concepts that weren't fully explained in the original document. Let's talk about defining versus replacing terms. There are two ways of handling complex terms from the original document. You can either define them or replace them with more common words. We talked about both of these in the earlier section, but I'll go over them quickly again. You want to define terms that readers are likely to encounter outside your plain language document. For example, if you're writing about different famous people who use AAC devices, you might decide that AAC device is a commonly used phrase in your document, so you could define it. If a term is less common, you should replace it with a simpler or more common term. For example, a document on AAC that's not specifically about modeling could rephrase a less common term, like modeling, to something simpler. Someone could reword this phrase to say showing someone how to use their AAC device. Then, they could explain what showing someone how to use their AAC device looks like. If you keep a complex term, make sure to list it in its definition in a glossary section somewhere in the document. When ASAN writes plain language documents, we call our glossary section words to know and put it at the end of the document. No matter what you call your glossary section, it should have all the important terms and definitions from the document. Here I've got a screenshot of a couple definitions from one of ASAN's words to know sections. The first term is deficit, which is defined as when the government spends more money than it gets from taxes. The second term is discretionary spending, which is defined as money the government can only spend when a budget bill is passed. Now, you'll want to actually write your plain language draft. Follow the features of plain language we already talked about. Take the document one section at a time. Don't try to do everything all at once. Just focus on one section, one paragraph, one sentence at a time. Remember that plain language writing is a skill. You will get better at it with time and practice. It's okay to be unsure when you're starting out. If you get really stuck, one trick I've found is to ask, how would I explain this to someone in conversation? Obviously, people don't write like they talk, but most people talk in simpler language than they write in. Starting from the point of an explanatory conversation can help you write in simpler language, too. Once you've written your plain language draft, it's time to check the reading level. Reading level scores reflect how easy it is to read a piece of text. Reading level accounts for things like word difficulty, sentence and paragraph length, sentence structure, and other factors. Plain language documents should be written at a 6th to 8th grade level or lower. At AAC, we aim for about a 5th to 6th grade reading level with our plain language documents. There are lots of websites that can check the reading level of the document. We mainly use the websites Hemingway and Readable. As a note, the Hemingway website is free, but there is a paid downloadable version for $20 lifetime. The Readable site requires a subscription that's about $50 per year. I'll talk about one more free resource for checking reading level a little later on. All reading level checkers score reading level using a group of scales. These scales can show a wide range of reading level scores for the same content. That's because the scales were designed for checking different components of reading levels in different kinds of text. For example, a scale designed to score children's books and a scale designed to score technical documents for engineers will check very different things. It is generally easiest to take the average of all these scores as your overall reading level. You should also go through the document and check places that the websites flag as being less accessible. Sometimes, these flags may be for reasons that don't matter. For example, reading level checkers will usually flag adverbs, but ASAN has found that readers in our plain language focus groups don't have a problem understanding adverbs. Other times, these flags may be a good hint to shorten a sentence or change a word. Okay, so on the slide is a screenshot of the Readable reading level checker interface. The text in the text box is the same text from last slide but in paragraph form. The reading level checker has rated this text to B grade, said there are 3 issues with it, that it has a reach of 100%, and that there are 114 words in the text. There's also a list of reading levels on the right side from different reading level checkers. The readability checker has flagged a couple of long sentences in yellow and a very long sentence in red. This slide is just showing you what the readable checker interface looks like. This slide shows the Hemingway readability checker interface. It's the same text as the last slide. On the right is a sidebar that says the readability is an 8th grade reading level, which it says is good. The reading level checker has flagged 3 phrases that have simpler alternatives, 1 sentence that is hard to read, and 1 sentence that is very hard to read. So let's talk about predefined hard words. Reading level checkers can't tell when you've defined a complex word. They just see a complex word. The checker also doesn't know what words your readers will already know. So, if you define aided language stimulation in your text, the checker won't know that. If you use the phrase autism spectrum in your text because readers will be familiar with it, the checker can't know that. Even words like disability throw off scores and make scores higher because the checker flags them as long, complex words. To get more accurate scores, you'll want to replace certain words or phrases with shorter placeholders. ASAN tends to use fruit words, like apple or pear. We call this process appling or paring down. We do this not to cheat the scoring system, but to make sure the scoring system is accurately measuring what it needs to measure. So let's look at another paragraph in Readable. This paragraph reads the House and the Senate both have a lot of small groups, called committees. Committees pay special attention to different topics, like education or the army. The committee that pays attention to how to spend the money in the budget is called the Appropriations Committee. The House and the Senate both have their own appropriations committees. This paragraph is rated a B grade, has 5 issues, and has a reach of 94%. Appropriations and committee are both words we defined earlier in the document, so let's replace them with simpler words and see how that brings down the reading level. Okay, so this slide shows the readable checker after we've replaced the predefined words with simpler ones. In this case, we replaced committee with banana and appropriations with apple. The paragraph now reads, the House and the Senate both have a lot of small groups, called bananas. Bananas pay special attention to different topics, like education or the army. The banana that pays attention to how to spend the money in the budget is called the apple banana. The House and the Senate both have their own apple bananas. This paragraph sounds a lot sillier, but replacing predefined words has brought our reading level down. The text now has an A grade, only 3 issues, and a reach of 100%. This slide is showing how the reading levels changed when we replaced the predefined words with simpler ones. There are 5 reading level scoring systems listed here. When we replaced the hard words with easier ones, 4 of the 5 reading level scores fell. The 5th one stayed the same. Several scores fell by multiple grade levels. This illustrates how replacing predefined words can really bring down reading levels. So now we're almost at the end of the presentation, and it's time for you to try it on your own. There are 3 examples of technical or difficult language paragraphs that you can translate into plain language. These examples all come from the paper Promotion of Communication Access, Choice, and Agency for Autistic Students, written by Donaldson et al. In 2022. I will read each example out loud. Then I will move on to the slide that has an example of the plain language translation. You can pause the recording for more time if you need to. Or you can check the slides that are uploaded with this presentation. You can use the Hemingway editor or Readable to check your reading level. You can also use the automated readability checker from Readability Formulas. The first example is, families and professionals often consider augmentative and alternative communication, AAC, a last resort for persons with communication challenges. However, speaking autistic adults have reported that they would have benefited from access to AAC as children. This example has a reading level of 17.6, meaning it is at a post-college reading level. How would you rewrite it to be in plain language? Now, here is one way to rewrite this example. The rewrite says, augmentative and alternative communication, AAC, is the different ways people who can't speak with their mouths share information. An example of AAC is a text-to-speech app that speaks what a person types. Many people think that AAC should only be used if there are no other choices. Sometimes those people are parents of children who need AAC, or speech therapists. But speaking autistic adults say that AAC could have helped them when they were children. This rewrite has a reading level of 6.2, meaning people with a 6th grade reading level can understand it. The second example is, we provide a brief overview of the AAC community and their preferred terminology, review the history of traditional approaches to research on AAC and autism, and then examine the relationship between disability models and ableism to views of spoken language as a priority of intervention. Studies on this topic are rare, and resisting ableism requires acknowledging and honoring disabled people's experiences and expertise. This example has a reading level of 13.7, meaning it is at a lower college reading level. How would you rewrite it to be in plain language? Now, here is one way to rewrite this example. The rewrite says, first, we'll talk about people who use AAC and what words they want us to use when we talk about them. We look at the history of the ways people usually do research on AAC and autism. Then, we look at how ableism relates to how people think about the goals of speech therapy. Ableism is treating people with disabilities badly because they are disabled. There are not many papers on this topic. We think everyone should be against ableism. But being against ableism can be hard. Being against ableism means valuing what people with disabilities know and have done. This is not something many speech therapists usually do. Because of this, we talk about how important autistic people's experience and knowledge is. We talk about what autistic people have done and how this connects to speaking. This rewrite has a reading level of 6.7, meaning people with a 6th grade reading level can understand it. The third example is, speaking autistic students who could benefit from AAC may not have access to AAC due to the prioritization of spoken language and lack of awareness of the benefit of AAC. We recommend that SLPs and school-based professionals support and facilitate access, communicative choice, and agency by implementing multimodal communication strategies to include AAC use for autistic students regardless of their spoken language status. This example has a reading level of 21.65, meaning it is at a post-college reading level. How would you rewrite it to be in plain language? Now, here is one way to rewrite this example. The rewrite says, many autistic students who can speak could also use AAC. But these students don't get AAC for two reasons. 1. Speech therapists and other people who work with these students don't know about AAC. 2. Speech therapists and other people who work with these students push the students to only use oral speech. We want more speech therapists and other people who work with autistic students to do two things. 1. Give speaking autistic students more access to AAC. 2. Make sure that speaking autistic students have choices in how they communicate. When students communicate, they share information. This means that autistic students shouldn't be forced to speak if they don't want to. This rewrite has a reading level of 6.0, meaning people with a 6th grade reading level can understand it. You'll notice that this example also has a numbered list to break up a sentence. That's also something you can do in plain language. Use bullets or a numbered list to break up a complex sentence into smaller parts. That is all for my presentation today. Thank you so much for coming. If you have any questions, you can email me at ddenome@autisticadvocacy.org. You can also email me if you need an alternative format for the slides or have other accessibility concerns. I also have AAC's contact information on the screen. We are on Facebook at facebook.com/autisticadvocacy. We are on Twitter at twitter.com/self-advocacy. Our web address is autisticadvocacy.org, and our main email address is info@autisticadvocacy.org. Have a great day, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation.
Donnie, thank you very much for sharing that information. We really appreciate it and appreciate you taking the time to share this with the audience. For those of you attending the session, thank you for being here, and we hope you can take the things that Donnie has shared and apply them in your interactions and the things that are going on in your life. We hope we'll catch you on another episode, or another presentation of AAC in the Cloud. Thanks.